This lecture is on arboriculture. Arboriculture is the cultivation of trees, shrubs, and other woody plants that humans use in landscaping, and the methods used in arboriculture are those that keep the tree healthy and safe for human use. A lot of arboriculture involves the proper pruning of trees. Let's look first at some anatomical parts of a tree and shrub. The leaf canopy is the part above where all the leaves are, at the tips of the branches. And the functions of leaves are photosynthesis to produce flowers and fruits. Within the canopy are also where the flowers and fruits are developed, and their function is to attract pollinators, those are the flowers, and then of course in the fruits are to form the seeds. Trunks and branches are to hold the leaves up, also to house the xylem and the phloem, which transports sugars, nutrients, and water. And of course the root system, and most of the root system is in the top 12 inches of the soil, and it involves the roots and the root hairs, which absorb nutrients and water and facilitate the decomposition of organic matter for nutrient uptake. In trees and shrubs is a direct correlation between a portion of the leaf canopy and the roots as well. So the part of the tree that has the roots on one side, those roots serve that part of the leaf canopy. If you're to cut away one whole side of a tree, of the leaves and the branches, those roots on that side will die out. So if you did do that, cut away about half of the tree from a fence or to open up a view, remember that the roots under there will die off also, and you'll have 50% less food production because you've removed the leaves, which do photosynthesis, but also 50% less ability of that plant to absorb water and nutrients. And those wounds that die off of both sides, you've taken off the top and then the roots die off correspondingly, will leave that tree open to more infection and disease. Never take off more than roughly 50% of the healthy tissue of a tree at one time to decrease the shock to the whole tree. When you damage part of the bark, especially around the trunk, that also damages the phloem and the xylem. The xylem and the phloem are thin layers in a cylinder right inside the bark. So when you do damage the bark like this, maybe perhaps lawnmower wound or weed whacker, you've destroyed the ability of the plant to move sugars up and down and water and nutrients from the ground up through that patch. If that wound went all the way around, it would completely kill the tree. That's called girdling. If you're going to install some kind of pipe or irrigation line, it has to go through the roots of trees. Remember that that will destroy the roots on that side if it cuts through from the top, the surface of the soil down. All the roots you chop through will die off, and that part of the tree, the leaf canopy that was served by those roots, will be compromised, if not just die off as well. it's better than, still damaging, but better to create a tunnel underneath the roots. So you're cutting away and destroying the tips of the roots instead of completely chopping them off at the base, which is what you're seeing here on the right. On the left, tunneling underneath the roots would cause some damage, but less for the installation of an irrigation line. Here are 3 natural forms of shrubs, and the point is with trees too is just to know their natural shape. What kind of form do they naturally want to grow into? So you understand that when you're pruning them, so you're not constantly trying to keep them in a different shape than they want to go to, which can cause just, repeated pruning and labor, and can also hurt the tree and compromise their health. Properly pruning trees and shrubs will create a healthier plant, a safer plant. You'll have less limbs that fail and break off, and perhaps when they do, they can damage property and sometimes directly hurt people. You're also improving your job by creating less frequent of pruning and less chance for that plant to get diseased and needing some special care. And you're also creating more sustainability in general in the environment, less need for pesticide or fertilizer use for a plant that gets stressed from improper pruning, and less waste and less green waste as well. This slide just introduces you to a few terms, the 4 basic approaches to trimming trees and shrubs. There's crown cleaning, crown thinning, crown raising, and crown reduction. All of these referring to the leaf canopy or the leaf crown. And you can read the more specific detailed description of those below. Let me introduce to you the 3 types of cuts that can be used. These are the 3 main types. A reduction cut reduces the length of some branch and you cut it all the way back to the next live lateral branch that's large enough to assume apical dominance, meaning you're cutting that all the way back and that lateral branch then becomes the main branch when it grows some more next year. This is also called a lateral cut, a drop notch cut, or a thinning cut, and it's used to decrease the density of the canopy and also decrease the height and width. A heading cut is where you cut a branch off, but you cut at the internode, so in between the 2 lateral branches, and it doesn't cut it all the way back to the next branch, the next lateral branch, as the reduction cut did. This reduces the canopy density, but also the height, but it won't reduce the width too much. It does not stimulate interior foliage growth, as some other cuts can. This is also called pinching, shearing, tipping, rounding over, or topping. A removal cut cuts it back all the way to the trunk usually. You're removing large branches. Maybe there's too many of them sticking up one way. You can be used to reduce the canopy, but not the height, because some are still left just as tall, or the width. Some are still left just as wide. And it can invigorate interior foliage growth, also called a thinning cut or collar cut. Let's look at some basic parts and some terms related to them for pruning cut locations. The branch collar is a small thickened area at the base of the branches. The nodes are the growth points along the branch where the branching occurs. Place of new cell division, like where a leaf comes out or a new branch comes out, that's a node, an area of growth. A lateral branch is a smaller branch coming off a bigger branch. And the branch bark ridge is that area where the bark from the lateral branch and the main branch, kind of in the armpit up on top of those two branches, where they come together, the bark comes together and pushes against each other, forming a small ridge. Two types of cuts you can do. One would be lettered B in this image, and it's just where you're taking off a lateral branch, but it's relatively small and not a lot of weight on it. You can make just one cut right where you want that cut to be, right down by the branch collar, cleanly all the way through. You don't want it flush following the the line of the main branch you're cutting back to. You want it at a little bit of an angle right down to the collar, but not all the way inside the collar. On the picture on the right, this is a 3-cut method used to remove a branch that has a lot of weight to it. So this lateral branch, let's say it's pretty big and has a lot of weight on the end. Your first cut would be a couple inches or a few inches away from the branch collar, underneath, just a small, about a third of the way through. The second cut is further out, taking all the weight off of it. And now if that, as you're cutting, imagine cutting that second cut from the top, and you get about halfway through, and there's or maybe 3/4 of the way through, and there's so much weight of that branch, it starts to bend down and starts to peel the bark on the bottom. That first cut will stop the peel of the bark from going all the way into the main branch. So that's what the first cut is for. The first and second cut are to take the weight off without the bark starting to peel all the way down from the lateral branch into the main branch, which would damage the main branch, needlessly. So the third cut is your final cut, just right against the branch collar where you want the final cut to be. This describes that 3-cut method in text, the same method as the slide before. Some bad cuts would be where you didn't do that little underneath cut. You can see in letter C on the left, the bark you're starting to cut there, but it's heavy enough that it starts to peel down and peels and rips the bark off into the main branch, which would damage that branch and leave the wound bigger than needed and cause more ability for pathogens and diseases to get in there. The center image or illustration is a flush cut where you cut all the way down past the branch collar, and that wound is also really large and can be damaging, and the tree can't heal over that cut very well. It's just too big. And the stub cutting on the right, you didn't cut down far enough up to the branch collar, and you leave these little stubs that they're big enough that they stay there and they never really go away and they don't look too good. Topping and boxing refers to simply cutting almost indiscriminately the tops off of the big branches, all the major branches, and sometimes done like to reduce the size of a tree, get it underneath a power line or underneath a sign that it might be hiding the building, and people, the owners of the building want you to see that building and the sign of what's in there. But it's done kind of dramatically and harshly, and it shocks the tree, causes this kind of witches brooming like regrowth, and is overall a bad idea. That topping and boxing hurts the trees, stresses them out, can increase pest problems because of their increased stress, can create hazards from the new weak growth. Those branches don't have a very good connection to those severely cut off branches, and they can fall easily. It doesn't look very good, creates an unnatural shape, and it can be expensive. These trees are going to need more care because they've been so stressed out. There's a lot of text in this slide, and you can read through all of it if you like, but also listen that the main idea is this acronym called CODIT, compartmentalization of decay in trees. If trees get some decay in them, they will naturally seal off that area of decay by plugging up the cells around it, especially in the wood, the xylem, so that decay can't spread. And you can see in this bottom picture, there's been some decay when the tree was younger, and then it kept growing, but the decay was kept in the central area by the tree. The tree compartmentalizes it, plugs up the cells with this lignin fully around it so that disease can't spread. This is one of the worst prunings that I've seen around town, where they just cut the major limbs of this tree all the way back, and then they glued plastic flowers to the tips. This is a house on Foothill Road, and if this is your house, I'm sorry. So now let's talk about structural pruning of trees. It's something you do to a tree when it's young to increase the strength of the tree as it gets older. And it also reduces limb failure. So you're taking out limbs that have weak attachments to the trunk. So they're stronger as they get older. They don't tend to fall off as easily. And that reduces long-term maintenance too. And the tree is healthier overall. Some of the main points in structural pruning is to remove the codominant leaders. Leaders are the branches or the parts of the trunk that go straight up, and you want it to be the central axis of that tree. Removing competing leaders, or what are called codominants, is important. Look at the left picture, solid branching. You see all of the branches coming off that central leader going straight up. And the branches coming off on this left picture are almost, are close to 90-degree angle to the main trunk. The closer it is to 90, the stronger that connection is. There's more type of wood that's really strong, and called compression wood, that forms around that connection. So that's the best type of connection that will have the least likelihood of falling off or being broken off. If you look here in the center picture, codominance, so there's like 5 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 branches that are all pretty much going up. And the problem with that is that those little areas in between those branches, that little kind of narrow, acute little angled areas, water can get in there and it can seep down in between the two leader codominant stems and cause rot in there. So you want to maintain a single leader, remove the codominants down to one leader, and keep the lateral branch diameters about 1/2 the diameter or smaller than the trunk. Look back to the first picture on the left. The diameter of these lateral branches sticking out from the trunk are about 1/2 the diameter or smaller than the trunk diameter. Ratios greater than 70%, so if your lateral branches are more than 70% the size of the diameter of the trunk, they're more likely to fail and fall off and cause problems. They're unsafe and they can damage the tree too. Now look at the picture in the far right. There were 2 codominant leaders, both going pretty much straight up, but that little kind of area in between, water got in there and the bark did not seal over properly, so it was kind of growing down into the little crack, and it caused a weak spot in that tree between the 2 codominants, which ripped in the wind. This slide is to show you or prove to you that these codominant leader stems, like you see in the left picture, can be problematic, because of just physiologically what they're like in the interior of those stems. You can see where those pencils are pointing. These are 3 codominants, but these lateral branches are at a pretty acute angle. They're not close to 90, and you can see where the bark between those 2 pointed, like with the yellow pencil pointing to that kind of darkened line that goes all the way down to the main trunk. That is weak wood in there because there's a little bit of bark in there which does not form a solid bond between the lateral branch and the trunk. So that can easily get water in there and split. So removing included bark, that's what this is called, bark included with inside the interior of the tree, which creates weak spots. Here's 5 steps to training young shade trees. Some of them we've already gone over. So first, pruning is very generally used to remove dead wood, diseased wood and branches, damaged branches, rubbing branches, and weakly attached branches. 2, select and establish a central leader. 3, select and establish the lowest permanent main scaffold stem. Those are the laterals. 4, select and establish other scaffold branches that might be lower than you want them to be, but leave them there for a while because they feed that trunk of the tree and help that trunk in the lower areas become larger in diameter and more strong. And 5, select temporary branches below that lowest permanent scaffold, like I just said, to increase the caliper. Also consider that pruning isn't always necessary. It depends what you're trying to do. Of course, when you're dealing with trees that are around people and things like cars, you don't want branches falling on either of those things. But the placement of a plant in a space that's adequate for the natural size and shape of that tree will help reduce pruning and labor. And it just whenever you prune a plant, you are damaging it and stressing it out to some degree. So if you don't have to, don't. And that sometimes involves putting it in the right place that allows its natural growth. There also are times when pruning is maybe necessary, like removing, like I said before, crossed, damaged, weak, or diseased branches, minor corrections to young trees to develop good branching structure, that's structural pruning, and safety pruning to remove branches that might become a hazard by falling. Pruning should be done from the inside, not from the outside, except in espalier trees or hedges. And hedges can, those are types of plants that are chosen for hedges that can handle heavy pruning, and they're fine with that. Of course, controlling the size of fruit trees where we intentionally have them placed in too small a space on the principle it's better to do so and enjoy the fruit tree than have nothing, simply because our land isn't big enough to accommodate fully developed trees. So we have to think about how we prune them and why we prune them, and why we're planting them exactly where we do. Is that good for the tree's health, or is that just what we want? And why have we been so bent on pruning? Humans have been pruning for many, many decades and centuries even. People love to prune plants and feel in control of things and find it difficult not to clean up a badly structured plant. So there's reasons that are good for pruning, like the health of the plant, but there's also reasons why we might need to step back and not prune so much if we don't mind the way it looks and it's not a safety hazard to humans or other living creatures or to the trees themselves. So now let's talk about fruit tree care, part of which involves pruning. And some of this is repetitive, but we're talking specifically about fruit trees now. Of course, caring for the safety of the human that is caring for that fruit tree is one of the first things we think about. Of course, protecting your body when you're doing the pruning and tree care, and identifying any possible job site obstacles before you approach to take care of that tree. Maybe there's insects around, that beehive, poison oak, something like that, or you're putting your ladder to prune it on really soft ground. Make sure all of that is safe ahead of time and think about it and plan. Identifying the tree and its growth form and fruiting patterns is important. Things like peaches, plums, nectarines are stone fruits, the ones that have the hard pit in the center. Most of those fruit on 1-year-old wood, so last year's growth, not the current year's growth, is what produces the fruit. Pomes, things like apples, pears, quinces, and pomegranates, fruit on the current season's growth. So you want to think about that when you are pruning. You don't want to take off the part that needs to be left there for fruiting. And that's why we have these fruit trees, just to grow fruit. AAPP is a shortened way to remember apple, apricot, pear, plum. 2 are pomes, 2 are stone fruits. And most of those produce these spurs, which are 2 to 4 inch little stems on the inside of the tree from which they fruit. Year after year on these, they flower and fruit on those spurs. So you definitely want to be able to recognize those after you've identified these types of trees and not prune those off. Also know if your tree is a dwarf or a full-size tree or a semi-dwarf. Is it grafted? And know the rootstock type. That's going to be helpful for your ability to care for that tree, and especially for pruning. Is this a young tree, a mature tree, a tree that's slowing down if not dying? And knowing about the surrounding environment too and what that plant needs, chill hours, sun, pollinators, etc. All of these are important for its care. In addition, knowing a tree's health status and knowing the signs and symptoms. Here are some types of symptoms you may see that indicate some kind of pathogenic problem or disorder: brown rot, gummosis, bacterial, fungal problems, insect damage, and other animal damage as well. Diagnosis of the diseases and disorders really is an art form and involves knowing lots of information about that tree and its background, its form, its natural ways, its health, what it looks like when it's healthy, and then what are the signs and symptoms of a possible disorder or disease, and then treating it properly too. And here are some more treatment methods of the soil and the roots that can help you in taking care of your trees. Lastly, some things you may want to do during the dormant season to take care of your fruit trees. Some fruit tree care involves growing season care, and that would be you can do some pruning during the growing season. Mostly it's done in the dormant season, but there are also some pest control methods that want to be done in the dormant season. So you have to find out about your individual trees and what they need, but realizing that fruit tree care goes year round, and there are seasons for certain types of activities that you'll find out from getting to know specific species and cultivars that you're growing and what they need.